from New Hampshire.
Mr. President, I came to the floor today to talk about the importance of the Senate's vote to ratify the accession of Montenegro into the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO. And I'm confident that we will see an overwhelming bipartisan majority of our colleagues here in the Senate support Montenegro's effort to join NATO. This is in Montenegro's interest, it's in Europe's interest, and it's in the national security interest of the United States. NATO is the most successful security alliance in history, and it is essential to the stability, freedom, and prosperity that Europe enjoys and that the United States has enjoyed, really to that stability that's existed since post-World War II. NATO has provided the security, stability for the freedoms we enjoy and the prosperity. Montenegro's accession to NATO will help the alliance become more resilient, and it will deter Russian aggression on Europe's eastern flank, which is why the alliance invited Montenegro to become its 29th member last year. Now, I agree Montenegro is a small country, but it is geopolitically important. Its membership in NATO will complete the alliance's control of the Adriatic coastline, and that will strengthen NATO's southern border. Since its independence from Serbia 10 years ago, Montenegro has pursued inclusion in Euro-Atlantic institutions, and it's been a good partner to NATO. For example, Montenegro has contributed ably to the mission in Afghanistan, which is the only time Article 5 of NATO has been invoked. It was after the attacks of 9/11 on the United States, and our response was to go into Afghanistan. Montenegro joined us along with our other NATO allies in this effort. Montenegro has also imposed sanctions on Russia for its aggression in Ukraine. Montenegro's accession to NATO is also critically important for the wider Balkan region, which faces increasing Russian influence and interference. I mean, after all, remember, the two major wars of the last century, World Wars I and II, started in the Balkans. We need to do everything we can to maintain stability there. This is one of the things that I believe Montenegro's accession to NATO will help us do. And we saw that increasing Russian influence, that increasing effort to destabilize the Balkans last year in Montenegro's fall elections. Since those elections, Montenegrin authorities have arrested several people in connection with a coup attempt and a plot to assassinate Montenegro's prime minister. And there is indisputable evidence that ties both violent plots back to Russia, which was trying to eliminate a high-profile supporter of Montenegro's accession to NATO and install instead a pro-Kremlin political party there. Montenegrin police are still working with international authorities to locate the suspected Russian masterminds of these efforts. But when the bipartisan CODEL from the Senate and House, led by Senators McCain and Whitehouse, went to the Munich Security Conference in February, we had a chance to meet with Montenegro's Prime Minister, Đukanović. He told us in very vivid detail about the efforts to assassinate him and about Russia's efforts to install instead a pro-Russian government. Now, do we really think that Mr. Putin, who desires nothing more than to weaken the NATO alliance, would work so hard to disrupt Montenegro's inclusion in NATO if he didn't think it would strengthen the alliance? Approving Montenegro's accession to NATO would signal support for Montenegro's independence and sovereignty and for their continued efforts to move towards the West and away from Russia. It would also demonstrate our solidarity with countries like Montenegro that Vladimir Putin is trying to bully, especially in light of our own recent experience with Russian meddling in our presidential election. Now is a critically important time to send Russia the message that we will not tolerate this behavior. Last fall, a bipartisan group of diplomats, national security experts, and former administration officials sent a letter to Congress urging quick action on Montenegro's accession. Earlier this month, Secretary of State Rex Tillerson wrote a letter to Senator McConnell and Senator Schumer detailing the reasons Montenegro's accession to NATO is in our interest and urging that we schedule a prompt floor vote on the accession. Virtually all NATO members have already formally blessed Montenegro's inclusion in the alliance, so it's just the United States that hasn't taken this important step forward. The case for the Senate to support Montenegro's NATO accession is overwhelming. That's why it's so frustrating that it's taken so long. With Senator Johnson, I co-chaired the Foreign Relations Committee hearings on this subject back in September of last year. In December and again in January, the Foreign Relations Committee approved Montenegro's accession protocol, and efforts were made to secure the necessary agreement for the full Senate to do the same. These efforts have been blocked by just a few senators, despite the overwhelming bipartisan support for approval. Now, I'm glad that Montenegro's accession is finally getting the vote in the Senate that it deserves. The United States has long stood for freedom and democracy in Europe, and I urge my Senate colleagues to stand strong for freedom and democracy now by voting to approve Montenegro's accession to NATO. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.